So who here has heard of Iran Flight 655? Nobody. Okay. That's not surprising. I hadn't either. It's not surprising considering the U.S. government spends over 7 times as much funding on the military as it does on education. The U.S. military is more widely deployed than any other military in the history of the world, with troops on over 75% of the globe's nations. Throughout the U.S.'s rise to a global superpower in the past century, it has committed itself to a state of perpetual warfare in which we exist today. And in order to understand this change and how this came about, it's important to look at the history of the United States and the events that led to the United States' rise as a global superpower. And I think it all began in 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine. In response to European aggression in South America, James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, in which he established 2 tenets. First, that the nations in the Western Hemisphere would be considered as independent and free from European influence. And second, that they would be deemed republics like the United States and not monarchs like the European system was at that time. Now, there's an inherent contradiction in these 2 tenets in that James Monroe simultaneously claims freedom for these nations while also imposing American ideologies on them. Just kind of an interesting dynamic that continues throughout the century. Later, Theodore Roosevelt broadened the implications of the Monroe Doctrine with his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, in which he stated, "In flagrant cases of wrongdoing or impotence, the United States may be forced to exercise international police power." Now, this was huge. This was the first time that these words, international police power, had been used in the context of the United States. It set the United States far above other nations in that they were responsible to intervene in humanitarian crises across the world. Now, these principles continued throughout the age of imperialism, in which the U.S. expanded into the Pacific, annexing Hawaii and the Philippines. The Philippines sparking a war with Spain, in which the U.S. military absolutely routed the Spanish Navy, demolishing them as a global superpower and propelling the United States military to the forefront of warfare. Through economic spheres, the United States established dominance through their manufacturing industry of the 1950s. And the event that really led to the United States' rise to a global superpower was the end of World War II, in which the United States, along with the Soviet Union, defeated Germany, and these 2 countries were propelled to the forefront as twin superpowers. Now, Dwight Eisenhower recognized the perils associated with the United States' new position in the world. In his speech, he warned of the military-industrial complex, which is the relationship that the weapons industry has with the U.S. government, catalyzing the further instigation of wars so that this industry might be profitable. In his speech, he stated, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex." So Eisenhower foresaw the issues that the American position in the world would prove for the future. So, to summarize, the United States consolidated power in 3 main ways. Through the military. Since 2003, the United States has reported $2.3 trillion worth of military contracts, illustrating the effect of the military-industrial complex on our world. Economically, the United States has by far the largest GDP in the world, so United States consumption influences the economy of every other nation on the planet. And ideologically, through the Cold War, the United States established itself as a ethical beacon, I guess you could say, for the world, so that in any humanitarian crisis, in any crisis that they involve themselves in, they can set humanitarian reasons as a just cause. Now, it's really tough to see. Considering these factors in the United States' rise as a superpower, the United States has been hindered from entering war by the fact that Congress must approve war and not the president. However, following the 9/11 attacks, Public Law 10740, which is what this slide says, obviously you can't see it. Public Law 10740, the authorization of use for military force. This law states that it authorizes the President of the United States to take unilateral military actions against all nations, organizations, and persons, both domestically and abroad, who are alleged to be currently or in the past engaged in hostilities or who have provided aid in support of hostilities against the United States or any of its coalition allies. If this law sounds really wordy, it's because it is, and it's wordy because it's so broad. It provides the President of the United States power to declare a war not against an army, like we've seen in the past, but against an ideology. And it permits the President of the United States to invade any nation, regardless of borders, regardless of concrete objectives, regardless of a definite time span. It provides the President so much power for declaring war that he never had before this law's passage. And the President has utilized it. Since this law's passage in 2003, the United States has been militarily involved in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Haiti, Afghanistan, Iran, the Philippines, Colombia, and Liberia. And these are simply reported military actions. They don't include unreported drone strikes, offshore mobilizations of the National Guard, mobilizations of any non-Defense Department personnel. Basically, this list is way shorter than it would be if you included every military action that the United States has taken. In order to accommodate for the changing scene of war and the vast expansion of our military influence, the United States has also involved a shift in warfare tactics, away from human soldiers and towards mechanized warfare. Since Obama's presidency, since 2008, he's executed 101 drone strikes in Pakistan alone, more than twice the 45 that Bush executed during his term. Now, this just illustrates the vast increase in drone warfare that our military is experiencing. Furthermore, Pakistan is a nation that we are not even officially at war at, and that illustrates the freedoms that Public Law 10740 permits to the president. The fact that Obama has sent flying hellfire-spitting robots into Pakistan over 101 times without consent from Congress, without the consent of the American people, illustrates the vast expansion of the military. Now, I believe the shift to mechanized warfare, the reasons for it are twofold. Primarily, I believe it's to protect American soldiers. When robots are fighting our battles, American soldiers are not at risk, and that is of primary concern. But a very close second is the fact that drone warfare permits the president to expand military actions without the consent of the people. It's much easier to justify intervention in a nation when you're not putting American lives at risk. In other words, the American people don't care when a robot gets shot out of the sky. Furthermore, these drones have been proven to not be as effective as traditional military actions. The New America Foundation conducted a study in which it found that over a dozen times more low-level fighters were killed during drone strikes than mid to high-level fighters. Furthermore, a whole third of those killed by drone strikes are civilians and not militants. So, everything I'm saying has pretty eerie connections to George Orwell's novel 1984. I don't know if you guys have read this. Yeah. And I'm not suggesting that the United States is a oppressive totalitarian dictatorship and that we're all zombies. But it's impossible to ignore the connections between the United States' situation of warfare, and George Orwell's predictions in 1949. He states, "The war is not meant to be won. It is meant to be continuous. Hierarchical society is only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance." Now, the fact that the United States was involved in Iraq for almost 10 years, and as soon as we pulled out, ISIS took over, just illustrates the impossibility to fight this ideology that exists in the region. Now, does perpetual warfare encourage hierarchical society in the United States? Well, the government certainly rationalizes decisions based on warfare. For example, Guantanamo Bay is a military prison set up in 2002 in order to detain foreign suspected terrorists. The United States justifies the detention of these terrorists under international law supporting armed conflict. In other words, the United States has the ability to forego certain protections offered by the law due to the fact that they are at war. Protections such as habeas corpus or protections against enhanced interrogation are foregone in the fact that it is a military necessity, according to the government. Another example of the United States' justification of vast expansion justified by warfare is the National Security Agency, kind of unveiled by Edward Snowden a few years ago. The National Security Agency uses tracks your cell phone records, tracks your location by your cell phone, has coerced every major internet corporation into giving them information. I didn't even know this before doing this research, but every continent on the globe is connected by a vast system of cables that run under the sea. And the NSA actually has nuclear submarines that house the technicians and gear necessary to place physical taps on these cables on the seafloor across the world in order to send information to their metadata base, in which they collect information about every individual, at least in America, probably on the planet. Now, what does this mean for our generation? These are some pretty scary implications. And you might say, okay, I'm one individual within millions and millions, and my fraction of metadata is too small to care about. But the fact remains that the United States is collecting data on every citizen without their consent. And the information asymmetry that this produces between the American people and the government is huge. The American government has information about you in which, if ever need be, they could utilize against you. And talk about creating a hierarchical society. This creates government officials who have so much power over the individual citizen. That seems a little bit messed up to me. I don't know. So, I asked earlier who had heard of Iran Flight 655. No one had, not surprising. In 1988, the U.S. Navy parked ship Vincennes in the Persian Gulf during the Persian Gulf War, and in order to protect offshore oil imports. At the same time, a commercial flight took out of Bandar Abbas Airport, and the Vincennes shot 2 surface-to-air missiles at this commercial flight, taking it down, killing 290 innocent men, women, and children. And I took American history 3 separate times throughout middle and high school, and I never once heard of Iran Flight 655. And this example just goes to show how U.S. military intervention, it doesn't solve issues, it simply perpetuates conflict. It's easy to know why there's so much anti-American sentiment in the Middle East when things like this happen. The United States has shifted to drone warfare in order to accommodate for their vast military expansions. And those who try and shed light on these infractions by the government, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, they're jailed or exiled for telling the truth. The American people's inherent acceptance of our state of perpetual warfare is accompanied by another inevitable acceptance, our ignorance. Thank you.